It's always a privilege for the Center for Effective Preaching to co-sponsor this symposium. If you want to know more about the center, on the table in the Great Hall, there are the new brochures of the center, and they're there for you to take, and they tell you all about who the center is and what the center does. So please feel free to take one and participate in all our activities too. I want to take a moment of personal privilege, if I might. Many of you know that Dr. Don Schmeltikoff is retiring, and this will be his last symposium as the director of the Center for Ministry Effectiveness. I know that all of you would want to express your appreciation to Don for all the ways he has served us as a seminary community, as a university community, as the Waco community, as the national community. So let's take a moment now to say thank you to Dr. Don Schmeltikoff. I'll introduce the responders all at the same time, then they'll come one after the other, and when they have finished their responses, then Mrs. Eberstadt will respond. Dr. Byron Johnson is Distinguished Professor of the Social Sciences here at Baylor. He's the founding director of the Baylor Institute for the Studies of Religion, also known as ISR. It's known for many things and many contributions that it makes in a continuing way to our understanding of religion in America. Maybe most familiar to some of you will be the Baylor Religion Survey, which began in 2005 tracking what Americans really believe. He's a senior fellow at the Witherspoon Institute at Princeton, senior research scholar at the Institute for Jewish and Community Research in San Francisco, chief advisor for the Center for the Study of Religion and Chinese Society in Peking University. Before joining the faculty at Baylor, Johnson directed research centers at Vanderbilt and the University of Pennsylvania. He recently completed a series of empirical studies for the Department of Justice on the role of religion in pro-social youth behavior, and is a member of the Coordinating Council for Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. That's a presidential appointment. He is recognized as a leading authority on the scientific study of religion, the efficacy of faith-based organizations, domestic violence, and criminal justice. His recent publications have examined the impact of faith-based programs on recidivism, reduction, and prisoner reentry. There are more periodicals and books than I dare try to mention, but the latest thing I was aware of was a March 27th issue of the Wall Street Journal, where he co-authored an article entitled, "Can Faith Rewire an Addict's Brain? New evidence shows that God consciousness can keep young people off drugs and alcohol." Dr. Johnson is qualified in many ways to respond to our speaker. Dr. Julia Hejduk joined the Baylor Classics Department in 2003 after teaching for 10 years at the University of Texas at Arlington. She received a BA in Classics, summa cum laude, from Princeton, an MA and PhD in classical philology from Harvard. She is particularly fascinated by the phenomenon of intertextuality, both ancient and modern. Her research interests include Latin poetry, especially as it sheds light on Roman religion and on women in the ancient world. Her knowledge of the Roman world, in which Christianity was born and flourished against all odds, makes her especially qualified to address our topic. Dr. David Solomon has returned home once again and is serving as Baylor as visiting professor of philosophy. He received his BA from Baylor, his PhD from the University of Texas. He joined the Department of Philosophy at the University of Notre Dame in 1968 and has remained there ever since. He has been a National Endowment of Humanities Research Fellow at Oxford, a Milbank Research Fellow at Boston University, a University Research Fellow at Oxford, and a visiting professor at Baylor in 1994, 95, and now once again. The founding director of the Notre Dame Arts and Lettered Science Honors Program, the Notre Dame London Program, but most important, he is the founding director of the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture, serving as that director from 1998 to 2012, and now serves as director emeritus. His research interests have focused for the most part on issues of contemporary moral philosophy, with special interest in medical ethics. So he's director of the Notre Dame Conference on Medical Ethics since 1986. He's the author of numerous articles and books, which have appeared both in scholarly journals and more popular journals. He's appeared frequently on television, including The Firing Line, and has been the academic advisor for many years to Notre Dame's nationally syndicated PBS television program, Today's Life Choices, on which he frequently appears. He's lectured at over 100 colleges and universities in this country and in Europe. Dr. Solomon is well qualified to speak to our topic. So will you join me in welcoming these three as they come to respond? Let's let them know we're glad they're here.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here to participate in this wonderful session. Let me just say off the top, in full disclosure, Mary Eberstadt, I'm like one of her biggest fans. And we've been friends for a number of years, and we have had all kinds of conversations about ways in which we can work together. She lives in Washington, D.C., and as some of you may know, Baylor is extending our presence into Washington, D.C., and it's people like Mary Eberstadt that we want to be connected to. And just an aside, one of the wonderful things about Mary is that she mentors people. And one of the things that I need to have on my bio is that I too mentor. I think mentoring is a profoundly important thing for all of us to do, and especially here at a university and beyond. And so there's a number of women that meet regularly once a month, I believe, with Mary. They just seek her out. And these are really thoughtful, bright women in the beltway of our nation's capital that she's really been a godsend to. So this topic today, this is a great book, and it's an important book, it's an important topic, and so just let me respond to a few things. I tend to agree with Mary on everything, and so I want to echo a lot of what she said, that it is a complicated topic. This whole issue of secularization, for example, is quite complicated, and how do we look at it? I love what you said, Mary, about there's a pessimistic view, and then there's this optimistic view, and you kind of lean toward the optimistic, and I kind of jump toward the optimistic. And so the only way in which we're different is I see things even more optimistically, perhaps, than Mary does, even though there's plenty of bad news out there. So, for example, let's just talk about secularism for a second. One of the things that so many scholars like to do is to talk about the decline of religion, and you heard Mary address that very well. One of the few things that you don't hear scholars talk about is atheism. Atheism in the United States has hovered at 4% for over 70 years. It's one of the most stable statistics that we have. It hasn't grown one bit. And although the figures are higher in Europe, they're also stable. And in fact, we have asked questions of atheists on surveys, and guess what? Some of them say that they pray. So I would say that 4% category has to have quotation marks around them. As they say, there are no atheists in foxholes, and I think it's interesting that a lot of atheists actually say that they pray. Who do they pray to? The nuns, not N-U-N, but N-O-N-E-S, has been the subject of a lot of speculation in the last few years, and we at Baylor have done some interesting work on the nuns. And what we find is that most surveys misrepresent the nuns. So when you see a long list, and in the General Social Survey and the Baylor Religion Survey, they all look very similar in that respondents choose from a long list of denominational identities. There's also a category at the bottom called none or no religion, other, and a lot of people check that mark, and in fact, more people check that box than they have in years past. So there is an increase in the nones. This has been interpreted to mean that atheism is on the rise. As I've already indicated, it is not on the rise. In our particular survey, we asked those that checked that box, none, no religion, we asked them 2 questions later in the survey if they attend religious services. And guess what? A significant number of them indicated they do. For those that do, we asked them if they could give us the name of the church they attend or the house of worship, and could they even give us an address? And they did. And some of these are evangelicals, Pentecostals. They go to storefront churches and missions that don't appear on this long list. And as you know, a lot of churches and religious groups do not even identify anymore that they have a denominational affiliation. So there is this interesting way in which the nones have been increasing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that people are detached or unaffiliated. Now, you could also argue that unaffiliation has gone up, and I don't know that I would debate that too much, but again, these are people that are not necessarily irreligious. There are plenty of people who just can't get out, but they watch a lot of religious programming, and it's very important in their life. So this is why we're actually thinking, Mary, of having a conference in Washington in the fall called The End of Religion, where we shatter some of these myths about the demise of religion. And as Mary accurately points out, religion is on the rise in many parts of the world. And in fabulous, fantastic ways, the trajectory is quite shocking in places like Latin America and Africa and other places. I think it's really interesting, this observation you make, because I saw it too at Penn, about some of these thriving student ministries that exist now that did not exist. I participated in them, and when I was at the University of Pennsylvania and at Princeton, and these are thriving groups, and it is interesting that they didn't exist before. So a couple of comments, and then I'll be wrapping up. It is so interesting to me that the family is one of the most neglected subjects within sociology these days. If you are to get a PhD in sociology with an emphasis on family, good luck getting a job. Good luck getting a job in sociology, period. It's a bad market, especially if you study the family. And if you study the family and you find there's a connection between increased faith and positive family functioning, you can kiss your career goodbye. You're not going to be high on anyone's short list for a job. This is a sign of some of the problems that Mary has alluded to. So there is something going on here. The family is critical. I mean, how can you ignore the fact the family is important, and we have so much published research to indicate that, but it's deeply troubling, and religion has been in the past the same way. A largely overlooked subject within the social sciences. Thankfully, that has begun to change in recent years. The last thing I want to talk about, demography, and Mary talked about this as well. People who are secular have less children. This is a global phenomenon. In many countries in Europe, they do not come anywhere near replacement. They're just not having enough children to sustain the population. And this is creating all kinds of enormous problems. Eric Kaufman, who's at the University of London and a non-resident fellow ISR, has written books on this subject of what it means, the changing demographic landscape. And what he concludes is that secularism eventually will be dealt a deathly blow, and that is that secularists don't reproduce themselves at anywhere near the rate that religious people do. So this is good news for Jews, Muslims, and Christians. We outbreed the other side. This is what's happening throughout the world. And at the end of the day, I think that this will be one of the more interesting things to see. I mean, you have conversion. That's absolutely an important fact, evangelization. But then this other thing of demographic shifts. What will they look like? Many of us are speculating that there will be a significant rebound in Europe, of all places, that Europe will become a society now that we call it a post-Christian society, but could it be in 50 years that we would call Europe, the first post-secular society? This is what I'm hoping for. I'm an evangelical, for crying out loud, and so I really do want to see that happen, and I think there's some indication that it could happen. So let me just wrap this up by saying we need so much more research on the connection between faith and family. I'm so glad to see Mary writing on this subject so beautifully as she does in so many different areas. Thank you for helping us dig deeper to understand the kind of complex relationships that are there, and I applaud your work, Mary. Thank you.
Somebody famous once quipped, "I've written you a long letter because I didn't have time to write a short one." Don't be alarmed, I'm not going to go over my 8 minutes, but I should warn you that I've written an overtly Christian response because I didn't have time to write a covertly Christian one. I'm not even considering rhetorically the question, since Christianity is a lie, what causes some people to fall for it? Instead, I'm starting from the premise that Christianity is true, and that every shred of evidence, historical, scientific, psychological, sociological, you name it, confirms that truth. The primary question Mrs. Eberstadt's thesis raises, then, is this: why does not having a family make people more likely to reject Christianity, while having a family makes them more likely to accept it? But before I address this, let me comment quickly on a point Mrs. Eberstadt mentions in passing. As an educator, I'm obviously pleased that there seems to be a correlation between more education and more God. And certainly that was true for me. My conversion in college arose partly through being confronted as a classics major with the world in which Jesus lived. I would submit that another reason the West lost God was because the West lost Latin, a little noted but important casualty of the 60s. Most modern young people, from whom ancient history means yesterday's tweets, simply have no awareness of the Greco-Roman world that for almost 2 millennia was a vibrant, shared reality for all educated people. Just as the child who grows up without a father has no intuitive conception of a paternal God, so the child who grows up without our cultural fathers, so to speak, has no intuitive sense that an event from 2,000 years ago could possibly be real or important. Just saying. But back to the topic. On one level, of course, the reasons people reject Christianity are the same as always: the world, the flesh, and the devil. Yet these temptations take different forms in different eras, and our challenge is to identify the strategy that the father of lies has adopted in modern America and Western Europe. Mrs. Eberstadt's book provides a stunningly simple yet compelling answer for why religiosity plummeted in the 1960s: the pill. This technology allowed people easily to separate humanity's greatest pleasure from its purpose, which is, as the church has always taught, to seal an exclusive, permanent, and at least potentially fertile bond between a man and a woman. If sex with no strings attached is readily available, then one of the primary incentives for especially men to assume the risks and limitations and heartaches of marriage evaporates. In the words of the immortal Benny Hill, "Why buy a book when there's a splendid Linden library in town?" Little wonder, then, if people hate the church for spoiling their fun. It's easy to see why extramarital sex drives people away, but why, as Mrs. Eberstadt felicitously puts it, do children drive their parents to church? Certainly there are lots of practical reasons for parents to seek the support of such a community. But a good secular support group could theoretically provide it as well. She rightly suggests that the powerful primal love and sense of transcendence experienced by parents puts them in a religious frame of mind. I would amplify this suggestion. Pregnancy, in a mystical yet real sense, is what Christianity is. Mary's fiat mihi, let it be done to me, was the dawn of the second creation. Just as God the Father's fiat lux, let there be light, was the dawn of the first. She became in that moment the New Jerusalem, the bride of God the Holy Spirit in a consummation of perfect intimacy. She became the new Eve, the mother of God the Son and of all who live in him, reversing with her obedient yes the disobedient no of our first mother that brought death into the world. And each Christian is called to do what she did, to say as best we can, be it unto me according to thy word. As Pope Benedict explains in Saved in Hope, faith is the substance of things hoped for, because through faith there exists within us, in embryo, invisible yet real, the whole true life. So is it surprising that women, and especially mothers, are universally more inclined to Christianity than men? Mrs. Eberstadt closes her reflections with some rays of hope that rather than a consistent downward trend in religious observance, we see a pattern of fluctuations and revivals. That people do, amazingly enough, occasionally learn from their mistakes. That Christianity has historically demonstrated to the atheist, baffling resilience, especially when it's persecuted. To quote Jurassic Park, life finds a way, and so do truth and love. My husband and I were both children of divorce and had no idea what parents who loved each other would even look like. And yet, that shared experience led to a greater understanding and intimacy between us, as well as a determination to make our marriage the magnum opus of our lives. In C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength, when the forces of evil try to corrupt Mark by assaulting him with images all somehow perverted and askew, their plan backfires. As the desert first teaches men to love water, or as absence reveals affection, there rose up against this background of the sour and the crooked some kind of vision of the sweet and the straight. Along with the disastrous economic consequences of shrinking birth rates, the spiritual sterility, dreariness, and loneliness of a solitary secular existence may ultimately drive people back into families and to church. It's also worth noting that whatever our forecasts, we don't actually have the slightest idea what God has in store. We do know that his strength is made perfect in weakness, that his sense of irony is exquisite, and that his plans are always better than anything we could have come up with. Look at the incarnation, death itself, sucker punched by a poor Jewish girl alone in her bedroom. I like to imagine the persons of the Trinity chuckling among themselves, bet they didn't see that one coming. When on the road to Emmaus, Jesus, the master detective, rereads for the disciples the narrative of salvation history, pointing out all the clues that led inexorably to his crucifixion and beyond it. They find, as will we, that the mystery of life turns out to have a supremely satisfying solution after all. In her book, Mrs. Eberstadt asks, how, apart from the Holy Spirit, could Christianity thrive and prosper at a time when the natural family is receding? The good news is, there is no apart from the Holy Spirit. I'll close with the sestet of Gerard Manley Hopkins' sonnet, God's Grandeur, a poem that finds hope and beauty even in post-industrial ugliness, and in which the word West is ironically appropriate to our discussion today. And for all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things. And though the last lights off the black west went, Oh, morning from the brown brink eastward springs. Because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breast and with, bright wings.
Well, good morning. Let me begin by adding my voice to the others and thanking Don Schmeltkoff for inviting me to participate in this symposium and for organizing it, bringing Mary to campus. It's a special honor for me to be speaking in this building from this pulpit. When I arrived at Baylor, alas, 54 years ago as a callow 17-year-old freshman moving into Coconut Hall, I carried my mother's hopes with me, her hopes that I would be a Baptist preacher. I'm sorry, Mom, this is about as close as I'll get, I guess, but this is something. I'd also like to thank Don for organizing the whole symposium and bringing Mary Eberstadt's great ideas to this campus and giving us an opportunity to discuss this remarkable recent book of hers, which combines brilliantly, I think, some reminders of things that we all know about secularization. It's a kind of reminder of things with some provocative and persuasive new ideas about why and how the waves of secularization have swept across the North Atlantic world in recent decades, especially the North Atlantic world, and also what the prospects might be for stemming this tide. It's a book that's ideal for both beginners to the secularization debate as well as for grizzled veterans. There's a lot in there. We all have something to learn from it. There's also much to comment on the book, far too much for a brief comment today, but I'm going to sort of pick on a couple of ideas that connect up with my interests and things I think are important. I'm especially interested in bringing Eberstadt's sort of broadly sociological perspective on secularization into contact with the take on secularization characteristic of my own specialty, moral philosophy. I'm sorry to bring in the sort of black forest of philosophy, but it has to come in. At some point, Mary's already said she doesn't want to talk about all that Descartes stuff, but alas, I'll not use that word, but it may be worse. My own particular engagement with these issues of secularization arises from my academic specialty, moral philosophy, and a kind of special interest I have in the history of moral philosophy and its engagement with culture from roughly the High Enlightenment until the present day. The dominant story of modern moral philosophy, that is, moral philosophy covering that period from the dawn of modernity in the 16th and 17th centuries up until today, is essentially the story of a quest by philosophers as different as Hobbes and Locke, Kant and Hume, Bentham and Coleridge, and contemporary figures like Rawls and McIntyre, to see if it's possible to hold on to an ethical conception of human action and human life in a world without God. That's the project of modern moral philosophy. Can moral commitment and insight do without religious formation and practice and its accompanying push toward the transcendent? For the most part, those philosophers we celebrate as the heroes of modern moral philosophy have answered that we can do ethics and indeed can be ethical without God. In fact, the modern liberal state, I would say, with its commitments to the merely formal values of equality and liberty, diversity and autonomy, to the exclusion of any concern with substantive questions about what kinds of lives are fundamentally to be preferred to others, that is, committed to the so-called liberal doctrine of neutrality with regard to the good, the modern state seems to be a bold expression of the optimism of modern moral philosophy that we can do fine, at least politically and by extension ethically, without God. A view, one might add, that has not been altogether absent from some loose interpretations of the traditional Baptist commitment to the separation of church and state. Now, indeed, the Baptist tradition reminds us of certain other views central to the ideology of the modern liberal state that hold not only that we can do ethics without God, but we can do it better without God. Proponents of modern secular ethics constantly remind us that their views came to prominence precisely as one of the consequences of the bloody and ruinous religious wars at the dawn of modernity, 16th and 17th centuries, which finally convinced modern people that religion had to be left outside fundamental conversations about the best ways to live, lest all these conversations founder on the deep and incommensurable debates involved in religious difference. Religious disagreement is too divisive, so this view holds, to bring into contact with ethical discussion. Put the point another way, ethical agreement is too important for both society and state for them to be mixed up with the incommensurable and rationally unresolvable debates between competing religious traditions. It just leads to Calvinists and Catholics killing each other in the squares in the center of Paris. Religion poisons ethics on this view. Not only then do we not need religious belief to discern ethical truth, we need to distance ourselves from it to have any chance of arriving at ethical agreement. Religious involvement in fundamental ethical debate is not only not necessary, but it's dangerous and must be avoided. Religion must be expelled from the councils of the ethical in the interest of the ethical itself. Overstating a point, but I think not too much. There are, to be sure, naysayers about this optimistic take on secularist culture by modern moral philosophy. The most eloquent and powerful philosophical voice in the last half-century raised against the dangers of secularization in this sense, this philosophical sense, has surely been the voice of Pope John Paul II, whose views are summed up in his well-known statement that when we lose the concept of God, we lose the concept of man. My own take on the central importance of the papacy of John Paul, and I think it's very important to these matters we're talking about today, is that he was simultaneously trying to reconcile the Catholic Church, and by implication the Christian community, but especially the Catholic Church, to the modern liberal state. In this regard, he could be seen as a kind of progressive liberal, the Catholic Church which had been at war with the modern democratic state until mid-20th century. At the same time, he was trying to specify the restrictions that the liberal state must recognize in order for this reconciliation to be consummated, that Christians could come home to the liberal democratic state. In this regard, of course, he looked like an arch conservative. He was always sort of schizophrenic in this way. The main restriction that he wanted to impose was that the liberal state must adopt as its central ethical notion not unrestrained autonomy, as it had seemed to do heretofore, and which in John Paul's words can only lead to what he called a culture of death, but the central notion has to be the foundational and universal dignity of the human person. That has to take the place of autonomy. Hence, his emphasis throughout his papacy continued in the papacies of Pope Benedict and Pope Francis on the non-negotiable dignity of the poor, the unborn, the elderly, the immigrant, the disabled, and the victims of the injustices of globalization and the wars of late capitalism. The problematic of modern moral philosophy, that is, the quest for a religion-free zone of conversation for ethics, what John Rawls, our most prominent contemporary political theorist, calls the realm of public reason, the problematic is quite different from Eberstadt's sociological problematic concerning secularization. She's interested in essentially three questions, and now let me bring this sort of philosophical excursion back to her presentation this morning. Eberstadt has three big questions. Is secularization real? If so, how is it to be explained? And third, is terminal secularization inevitable? The Nietzschean vision of religion fading. Now, she's interested in a way in what's really happening in the world, while philosophers are kind of interested, as usual, in what should happen, where there's a little more distance. Eberstadt's answers to her three questions are straightforward. One, yes, secularization is real, and it's had devastating impact on the lives of Christian communities. Two, the explanation for the onset of secularization is complicated, But a very important causal factor, and this is part of the creativity in this book, frequently overlooked, is what she calls the family factor. Disintegration of healthy, traditional families inevitably forms part, and an important part, of the causal explanation for secularization. And it's important, on her view, to understand this. Third, the third question, is secularization terminal in the Nietzschean sense? Her answer is no. Terminal secularization, as Nietzsche and others predicted, is not inevitable, just as the final disintegration of the family is surely not inevitable. So is the case. So it's the same case for secularization. Now, I should just say, I find Eberstadt's defense of these three claims absolutely plausible and convincing. There are lots of things to pick over. The material here is incredibly complicated, and there's room for picky points, but it seems to me she's right on all of these big questions. I want to just call attention to a way in which her sociological quest intersects, in I think interesting and important ways, with the philosophical discussion I just mentioned, and I'll say this very briefly. The connection is this. Eberstadt thinks that the fate of secularization depends heavily on the fate of the family. When the family sneezes, religious belief gets pneumonia, or at least a bad cold. The consequences are enormous. Secondly, she's optimistic, as we've seen, about turning around current trends towards secularization because she sees signs of the renewal of healthy family life. I think some of the most interesting parts of her presentation have to deal with this, and I hope we have an opportunity to talk about that later. And then, indeed, I think she's suggesting that an indirect way for Christians to combat secularization is by promoting healthy families. Now, the connection I see between her story and the philosophical story has to do with the following matters. Eberstadt does little in her book or in her presentation today to diagnose why the family is in such bad shape, although she insists strongly that secularization does not itself produce unhealthy families. The causal relation goes the other way. The bad families move us in the direction of secularization. And I want to raise questions about that. This seems to me the place where maybe I disagree with her a little bit, at least in a kind of indirect way. She's so insistent and intent, it seems to me, on emphasizing the impact that unhealthy families have on secularization, she fails to notice one important way, I think, in which secularization, in the guise of the secular ethics I've just been talking about, has contributed to the deterioration of families. There's a kind of feedback from secularization to the destruction of families. My position would be something like this, to state it again grandly oversimply. If I ask what are the causal factors undermining healthy family life today, I'm inclined to think that many of the arguments and institutional changes undermining healthy families have their origin primarily in the work of recent secular moral philosophy. Moral philosophers in my field of medical ethics and kind of general ethical theory have led the charge in developing systematic and powerful arguments in defense of unrestricted access to abortion, infanticide. It was in 1973 when the first article appears in a sober philosophical journal, very distinguished journal, best journal in ethics in the world, edited at Princeton, called A Defense of Abortion and Infanticide. And this, we're not talking just about dusty articles. The Groningen Protocol in the Netherlands, as you may know, is a procedure to allow parents to kill their children. The nation of Denmark has just set as one of its grand 10 top social goals to be Down syndrome free by the year 2025. And there's no way to be Down syndrome free without killing children. These same arguments have struck at the heart of the healthy traditional family and undermining our age-old sense of children as gifts as opposed to mere commodities. Our emphasis today in medicine on perfecting children largely by eliminating the ones who aren't perfect. Over 92% of Down syndrome fetuses in this country are now aborted with the aid and support of eager genetic counselors. There's also been a concerted attack coming out of this philosophical tradition on the use of the notion of dignity in moral context, precisely the thing that John Paul II had warned against. Some of you are familiar with the now infamous piece by Steven Pinker in the New Republic a few years ago called The Stupidity of Dignity. Now, sorry to throw all this at you in a rush. There's a lot of argument necessary to tighten up the link that I'm suggesting. I hope there's enough argument here, however, to show where I may disagree a little bit with the main themes of the presentation today. While Eberstadt may be right that secularization does not directly undermine healthy family life, but the causal chain goes the other way, our recent experience seems to me to show that the kind of ethical arguments produced by modern moral philosophy, itself a product of certain secularizing trends and shaped by the constraint that moral philosophy must not draw on religious views, this modern moral philosophy is likely to guide us in directions that will undermine families. This is, of course, a much more indirect route from secularization to unhealthy families than the one that Eberstadt considers. But it's a route, and it at least suggests that if we're to recover the healthy families she and I agree in seeking, philosophical argument will be part of what is required for success. We can't just go in and repair the families. We've got to repair the ideas that help destroy those families. It also suggests that the impact of secularization is often subtle and indirect, and for that reason, perhaps all the more dangerous. There's no doubt that secular ethics has undermined institutions like the family in ways that further promote secularization itself, which in turn feeds back into the conception of ethical reflection appropriate for our age. It's the kind of circle that John Paul II, again, in his discussion of the culture of death, kind of emphasizes, forces that kind of amplify themselves. I'm grateful to Mary Eberstadt for this marvelous presentation and this marvelous book, which helps us see a bit deeper into these very dark matters. Thank you.
Thank you. Excuse me. Pardon the voice. It's not really spring in Washington yet, but it is spring in Texas, I can tell. I'm even more humbled than I was before for several reasons. I'm really deeply honored to be here for Don's last session before his retirement, and I hope there's no causal connection between those two events. Congratulations. And I'm also daunted to be surrounded by all these doctors, because I only play doctor, and they really are doctors. And I thank them very much for their very interesting comments. So now we come to the point in the show where you see that the skill set that goes into writing, namely sitting by yourself in your pajamas in a corner somewhere, and the skill set that goes into extemporaneous speaking are completely divorced from one another. They had the advantage of seeing my speech and getting to write their remarks, and I have no such advantage here. So I hope you'll bear with me as I wing it. I would like first to talk a little bit about something that both Julie and David touched on, which is the sociological dimension of the book, or the sociological approach of the book. And I thank Julie for amplifying the Holy Spirit into the argument, and David for amplifying contemporary moral philosophy into the argument. I took the sociological approach deliberately because I'm trying to reach people who don't think the way most people in this room do. I'm trying to reach people by appealing to the evidence of their senses. And in the book, I note that although I have my own beliefs, and I explain all of that in a big footnote, it is also the case that most people who write about these things, as you know, Judith Jarvis Thompson, for example, in her essay Defending Abortion, doesn't have a footnote saying, by the way, I'm totally godless and all for the thing that I am talking about here. So there is an imbalance there, and I was trying to write it a little bit, R-I-G-H-T, by noting my personal biases, but then going on to say, I'm using secular evidence. This isn't a work of theology, and it's not that theology doesn't have its place, it's just that I'm not equipped to do it or to do the kind of moral philosophy. I thought David gave us a dazzling tour of that. I would also like to just expound a little bit on something Julie mentioned, which is the women problem in religion, the women issue. This is something I go at in the book a little bit because I think it's fascinating. You know, the other, in secular stereotyping, it's often put out there that Christianity oppresses women and, you know, et cetera. You know the drill. One of the several arguments that could be made against this caricature is that women, yes, are much more likely to be found in church, and social science has established that very well. But as a matter of fact, there is no difference in IQ between the sexes. Now let that sink in. So on the bell curve of intelligence, men are slightly more likely to be geniuses. They're also more likely to be severely retarded. That said, IQ breaks down between the sexes. Women are as smart, if you want to use that word, as men. Now, the reason I dwell on this is that I think that alone is evidence against the secularization thesis, because what it tells us is that there is something social going on. There is something going on about why are women in church more that is not about intelligence or oppression or anything like that. So I just submit that because I think that's sometimes useful ammunition in these ideological battles. I completely agree with David about the corrosive effects of contemporary moral philosophy, and I am familiar somewhat with the work of Steven Pinker, Judith Jarvis Thompson, the other people you cited, and I agree with you that it trickles down in a most toxic way and is something that we have to deal with. I leave it to those in the academy to deal with that, but nothing could be more important, and I'll give you a very concrete example of something I don't talk about in the book, but that I think is one of the most pernicious forces out there. Under the influence of radical individualism and libertarian philosophy, wrongly construed, in the secular public square, the idea that there's anything wrong with pornography is something that is just unbelievable to people. In other words, the success of the argument that this is a victimless phenomenon has been, I think, something that we really need to grapple with, because there's all kinds of evidence that pornography has harmful effects, of course, on men, women, children. Pastors don't have to hear that. They know that they're hearing that enough in their confessionals or in the privacy of wherever they talk to people. But in the public square, you will be hollered out and laughed at if you advance any such argument. So again, here is a case where I think a sociological approach is useful. I recommend some books to you that, again, use only secular evidence. The Social Costs of Pornography, put out by the Witherspoon Institute, and a volume that accompanies it, where there is testimony from therapists and people who see 25-year-olds who, you know, are kind of messed up for a long time by their addiction to this. And so there is clear evidence of harm in a way that the secular world has not yet acknowledged. And if I am not an activist, but if I could do one thing, I would set somebody on using the model of Mothers Against Drunk Driving and creating something that's Mothers Against Pornography. I was thinking Mothers of Daughters Against Pornography, but the acronym is too awkward. But I think that would be a very useful way of combating the kind of radical individualism that you are talking about, David, but from the ground up, and calling attention to the evidence of harm where we are told there is no harm, and there clearly is. That obviously isn't about the thesis of the book, but I would like to in closing, because I assume we're having discussion afterwards, I would like to I'd like to point to one elephant in all of this that hasn't been discussed yet, and this goes to Byron's point about optimism. And I really appreciated your comments about all that, and I look forward to this conference on the end of religion in Washington. May I also say, I wish Washington and Waco were nearer to each other, because I feel like we're neighbors in many ways. Anyway, about the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is, of course, the welfare state. How does the welfare state affect the family? Well, on the one hand, the fractured family is bankrolled by the welfare state, right? Because somebody has to be the provider. The worse the family has gotten, the bigger the welfare state has gotten, because the more it's had to step in where family and church used to step in instead. So the interesting way in which this bears on the future, I think, is this thought experiment. What is going to happen? What is going to happen to the family and the faith if the welfare states of the Western world are unsustainable? This is a very big question. If you read the financial pages, you see that every day you can find a story about what's going on in Western Europe, in Western European economies. I saw this up close and personal. I was in Barcelona for something a couple of years ago and saw what I would never have expected to see in a civilized place like Spain. There were riots in the streets. We took our 10-year-old into the hotel and stayed there all day because there were people out spray painting businesses and burning tires and doing all these things that you really don't associate with picture postcard Europe. Okay, so what is this about? It's about the fact that there is 40% unemployment in Spain. It's about the fact that their economy is in a shambles, and not only theirs, others are worse. This economic crisis is a family crisis. It's a demographic crisis. It has come about because the architects of the modern welfare state never foresaw the kind of demographic implosion that we have. You can say that's just dark clouds over Europe, but again, as with other trends, I think we're fooling ourselves if we just say Americans are different. I think we are more like Europe in many respects than we want to admit. So here's the question. What is going to happen? It may not be in my lifetime or yours, but in 50 years, the cradle-to-grave welfare state, at least in Western Europe, is completely unsustainable. We might be able to shore it up here by taking in more immigrants or whatever we do. We have a slightly higher birth rate, et cetera. But the point is this. If the welfare state implodes, or if it has to be reined back, if it has to be radically taken back, and because it can't provide all of the things that the Julia cartoon said it could provide, well, I predict in a perverse way that if we get to a point like that, then yes, the re-evangelization of Europe is not only possible, but likely, because people will have to turn back to what they know best, their organic bonds of family and church, et cetera, that have arguably been interrupted by having this elephant in the middle of the room, to mix up all my metaphors. We do know that adversity drives people home. It drives them home literally. We saw that after 9/11, for example, and this was very remarkable to me because I travel in some pretty secular places in Washington, everybody suddenly went back to church, right? After 9/11, people who had not been in church in decades were suddenly showing up. The churches were bustling. It was bizarre. It was like being in the Victorian England I was talking about earlier. Well, and then eventually all that went away, but why did it happen in the first place? It happened because adversity drives people home. So in a perverse way, I think this very dark scenario where government as we know it has to change under the sheer force of demographics could result in the groundwork for a religious and family revival. And since I think these things are connected at the root, you could just say, religious dash and dash family revival. And so that is, in a perverse way, the ultimate case for optimism, I think. But I thank you again and hope, because so many people came up with interesting things to say when we took our break. I hope you share those things with all of us as you think about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, panelists, and thank you, Mary. Okay. Questions or comments? If you aren't intimidated too much, come up to the microphone there and over here and ask your question or make your comment. Go. Do it. There we go. Thank you, sir. If you wouldn't mind, give us your name.
My name's Chris Martin.
Chris Martin.
And I've really enjoyed listening. Thank you so much. I have a couple of quick questions. The first one is about contraception, and I am Catholic, so if it's an odd question, that's why. But do you think that contraception and new contraceptive technology is something that's causing a trend towards secularism, or do you see it more as just a product of the new way of thinking? And if it is a cause, then how should society respond to that? So, and the reason I ask is because to me it's like the other elephant in the room, but when I mention it to people who are not Christians, or even who are, or even to Catholics, the first response is usually, what are you saying about our rights, about the Constitution? Was it a mistake to legalize it? So I just wondered if you had any opinion about that.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Is this okay?
Yes, it's on.
I have a number of thoughts about that. When you read secular sociology, some of the stuff I was citing and some of the things I talk about in the book, there's this remarkable, and I think remarkably funny thing that happens, which is a number of them document that there was this moment where religious practice and belief seemed to go over a cliff in the Western world, especially in Europe, although also here. And everybody agrees from using different kinds of numbers that this moment was 1963. And everybody sort of scratches their heads and says, well, I don't know why, but it looks like this is when it happened, and it's just, we can't figure it out. Was it the beginning of rock music? Was it this? I mean, there is a long list of things that are presented by secular thinkers to explain this, and obviously it's the pill, right? It is amazing that so little consideration has been given to the pill. The pill, well, as a priest in Rome at a pontifical council on the family said to me once, when I asked him what he thought caused secularization, he said, it's very simple. The pill washed over the world like a tidal wave, and it has yet to recede. And I think that's right. Now, I'm not going to get into what we all know are the theological differences about this, differences of opinion, but I think we can all agree on this. One thing that happens is that the pill is a gateway drug to abortion. It's a gateway drug. And that's why you see what sociology cannot explain, which is as the pill becomes more and more available at ever younger ages, abortion rates go up. Generally speaking, those are the two curves since 1963, well, since, 73. The good news here, and this is an example of human nature sort of righting itself a little bit, is that the millennial generation is more pro-life than the baby boomer generation. That is to say, fighting the good fight about abortion has made a difference. Science has made a difference. The sonogram has made a difference. And arguably, it is that same fight against abortion that is making some people reconsider the pill itself. I mean, at a minimum, we know that it made extramarital sex easier, and therefore the destigmatized extramarital sex. I think of it this way. I think of it as, it's like being at a great big party, right? Ever since the pill, the sexual revolution has been like a great big party that's completely out of control. So it's like being at a party that's out of control. Everybody, knows that it's really late at night and somebody ought to call the police. Everybody knows people are being hurt, but nobody wants to be the first one to leave, and nobody really wants to raise their hand and say, come on, guys, this is out of control. I think that's where we are. I don't think it's where we always will be. But I do think that 1963 is not an accident. I think the introduction of the pill put so much pressure on families and family formation and marriages because it made so many tempting things so possible suddenly that I think the priest in Rome was right, and we haven't figured out how to swim out of this yet.
David, you want to comment?
Yeah, am I turned on here?
Yes, you're on.
Yeah, I agree with everything Mary said. Arriving at Notre Dame, if I make a personal point, in 1968, a kind of nice Southern Baptist boy from Coconut Hall who knew nothing about Catholics, to arrive on a Catholic campus at the moment the birth control debate was in full force was an enlightening experience in all sorts of ways. You simply cannot talk about the pill at Notre Dame. Catholics, it's sort of like reminding them of the village in Ireland where they had an outdoor toilet or something. It's impossible to talk about it. I think there's absolutely no question, as Mary says, that the most important piece of technology in the mid-century is not the computer chip or it's the pill. It changed everything. I think the other thing that's obvious, though, and the questioner, I'm not sure what your view on this is, the contemporary state is unable to do anything about the impact of the pill. What I find interesting, and this goes to some of Mary's points about her optimism, we are surrounded at Notre Dame by young families who don't want to leave town. I think Baylor has this problem. 2, they nest around certain kinds of parishes. They have 8 or 9 children. They rehab old houses. And they're building communities completely outside kind of state and official structure, and they're taking care of, they're homeschooling their kids, and they've given up on the state doing anything about this. Of course, there's going to be no way for us even to think about the impact of contraception on the family from the point of view of public reason again. So it's going to be left to these smaller communities, and we'll see what happens, and very interesting and important things are happening right now. But the idea that we might go back to a time when we made it more difficult for people to get the through legislation or something, that train left the station a long time ago. But it's going to be very exciting to see what happens with these young families. It's a real response that is bring about real change.
Any other comments? Okay, next question, comment? Oh, I'm sorry, Julia. Go ahead, please comment.
I would like to comment, and this is also in light of your excellent question, Don, that you asked initially. What about women who work? What about women who have a vocation both to be wives and mothers and to do something outside the home? And to me, it simply isn't acceptable to say, well, those women aren't really doing what they're supposed to do, because they really should be following the model that, where you have 8 or 9 children and form these kind of insular communities. And I guess I personally believe that I truly have a vocation to be a wife and mother, and I truly have a vocation to be a professor, and I love both of those things. If I had to choose, I would choose to be a wife and mother. However, the husband that I married, if I'm certain of anything, it's that that's the man I was meant to be with. That's not what he wanted. He wouldn't have been interested in me if that's what I had wanted. And so there has to be some way of reconciling women who work outside the home and women who truly have a vocation to be wives and mothers. And I think that one of the things I would I would like to see acknowledged, and it's something that's so hard to talk about, but it is possible to reconcile that with the lack of artificial contraception. But it requires acknowledging that periodic abstinence is necessary if you want to limit the size of your family, and that is very, very hard. That is, in my opinion, the hardest teaching that the church has. That if you really want to, sort of space and limit the number of children that you have in such a way that it's possible to have a vocation outside the home, that's the via crucis. That is, and when people say, well, it's so wonderful to have a big family. Absolutely, it is. And I honor and admire the women who have devoted themselves full time to raising large families. But I think what the church really needs to wrestle with is the problem of women who want a family but also want to have a profession. And that's a hard question. And to pretend that it's easily reconcilable is just wishful thinking.
Terrific. Okay. Next question or comment, please.
I have a question.
Would you introduce yourself?
I'm Evelyn Offong, and I'm with the Waco Regional Baptist Association, and I also attend Truett. As we're talking, I'm thinking in terms of the definition, the secular definition of family that is quickly changing in terms of expressions of modern family. I think there's an elephant in the room also that has to do with not just women with raising children without their husbands, but women who are raising children with other women, or men who are raising children with other men, and redefining what parenthood looks like. And then I began to think, as we're talking, is your analysis, your research, is it looking into that dynamics? Because I think that train is also leaving, and I don't think it's going to return either. So my questions become, as I look at the church world, what should be our response to that? And if we open the church world up to that form of family, what should be their role within the church? It's quite a complex dynamic, wouldn't you think? So I'd like to hear something about that.
Very good.
Yes, thank you for asking that. From my perspective, and I don't write about this in the book, so I don't write about it in the book, but from my perspective, these questions, the purposely fatherless home, the purposely motherless home, fall to me in the category of experiments conducted on children. So we're conducting these experiments on children. They're very new experiments. We know that in the popular culture, they are not only judged to be acceptable experiments, but judged to be laudatory experiments. That's the popular culture. That's the modern family view. I think in the longer term, we are going to see results of these experiments that fall into the category of people learn. In other words, the children who are being treated in this way, who fall under the rubric of a family is whatever anybody who has acquired a child says is a family, the children being treated this way are not being considered from a moral point of view. Nobody's asking, is this okay for them? Now, I speak as someone who, who saw the movie Bambi at age 4. Remember Bambi? You know what happens to Bambi's mother? And who was so traumatized by that when somebody gave it to my kids, I put it on the top shelf, like up where some people would put Shades of Grey. I had Bambi up there. because it was so traumatic to think about this little deer losing his mother. Here's my point. If you can cry about Bambi, then why can't our society give one second thought to these children who are being brought into purposely motherless or fatherless homes? In order to give children to people who cannot be engineered to have them, all kinds of experiments are going on. India is the world capital for surrogacy tourism. And by tourism, I mean you can rent the womb of a poor Indian woman. Very often they're so poor that they bring their children with them to sleep in this place for 9 months while they carry the manufactured baby of some combination of wealthy white Westerners. And then in the 8th month or so, the Westerners go there and they get their tour of the Taj Mahal and they get to see India and go home with a baby that will never have a mother, that will never know a mother's arms. So my point is, we are conducting experiments that are going to look really bad in the rearview mirror. And that's how I think about these things. To say that is not to stigmatize people who love each other. It is to say that there are unseen victims in all of this, and we are going to hear from them someday.
Let me add an interesting wrinkle, because I think, Evelyn, your question was too, has this train already left the station? About 2 years ago, a study was conducted at the University of Texas, Austin, by a well-known sociologist, and he looked at the adult children of homosexual parents. And this is a national study, not a regional sample. The findings are kind of complicated, and so I'm not doing justice to summarize the findings in this way, but in general, what he found, he looked at homosexual and heterosexual relationships, and the adult children of heterosexual parents perform better on a series of outcomes. And again, you need to read the whole study to get the full set of findings. This is a tenured professor with a fabulous track record whose colleagues ever since then have boycotted him. He was asked to be fired at the University of Texas. There was an investigation. I have not seen in 25 years the kind of treatment that this professor received for getting a grant, doing a study, and publishing the study in a peer-reviewed academic journal. That in and of itself, especially when you have a finding as volatile as the findings from his study. So he did everything by the book, and yet he was being asked to be terminated from his position. It just shows you that there is so much pushback on any kind of a finding that would indicate heterosexuality is better than homosexuality. So, you know, maybe the train has left the station, but I do think this is why Christians need to be involved in these discussions. So I, along with 15 other professors from across the country, wrote a letter in response to the way that this person was being treated within the academy, basically standing up for them and saying that all this person did was do research on this important and neglected topic, and the research that was published was heads and shoulders above any previous research that had been done on the topic. So I do think that these issues that you raise, these are issues of our time. And that's one of the reasons why it's great to be at Baylor. We don't have to shy away from these things. I think we need to be involved in these discussions, and we certainly can't be silent. And one of the things I think that God has called a lot of us to do is to do serious research on this so we can weigh in and just let the evidence do the talking.
We're not leaving yet, so there we go. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Howard Jackson. Have thoroughly enjoyed all the comments, and you know, it just occurs to me, we talked about the elephant in the room, the train leaving the station. As I'm looking up at these banners, the one on this side says, "Love the Lord your God." You know, we were created to relationally love God, and then we were created relationally to love one another. And I think when we exchange loving the Lord our God for understanding God and loving our neighbor for understanding our neighbor, we depart and make things complicated when they really can be simple. And I think you know, the more complicated we get in trying to figure out the cause, the real cause was we quit loving God, we quit trusting Him. And when we quit trusting God, we quit trusting one another. And when we quit trusting one another, we start accusing one another. And so to sum up my comment, I think just simply, and thank you, Ms. Eberstadt and panel, for saying this. You know, we just simply need to love God and love one another.
Okay. Thank you. I assume you would all agree with that.
It's hard to disagree with that.
Right. All right, here we go. Thank you.
I'm Danny Crosby. I, too, have appreciated this morning very much. I have a couple of questions, and I wrote them down so I could be clear. How would you combat the effect of modern media and social media in terms of secular moral philosophy, as well as its sociological influence on family and family views?
Would you repeat the second part, Danny?
Starting where?
And repeat the whole thing, he says.
Okay. How would you combat, and I'm speaking as a pastor, how would you combat the effect of modern media and social media in terms of its secular moral philosophy as well as its sociological influence on family and family views? That's my first question.
I got an answer.
Okay.
Okay, well, I've got one very simple answer. And it's the route that my family and I have chosen: kill your television. I mean, I think actually television is another sort of elephant in the room in terms of... Pretty crowded. Yeah, really. It's a zoo, not a room. People don't realize this is an extremely dangerous and pernicious technology. Yeah, we don't have a television. That's my
Does
answer.
he turn it off or?
No, we don't own one.
Oh, you don't own one, okay, okay.
I second that. We tried not to have a television, and then came 9/11, and we live in Washington, and so we figured, well, we probably ought to have a television. Then came the computer, and then came the smartphones, and I think it's the biggest struggle for parents, really. Of the little pieces of advice I've picked up along the way, I have a friend who I think has a brilliant idea. Maybe some of you do this. You know, in the old days, if a gentleman entered somebody's home, there was a place where you would put your guns, right? And so she has a system where friends come over to see her kids, or her kids come in, and there's a big bowl, and in go all the toys. In goes the iPad, in go the cell phones, and that's really, I think, the only effective way of making sure that they don't take over the world. Right. That helps.
Julia, what's the response? Are your children still at home?
Two of them are.
All right, what's their response to the no TV situation?
Believe it or not, it's gratitude, because they all love to read. I mean, our house is so boring that the only thing you can really do to entertain yourself is read. And my son, my middle child once said, well, why do people need a TV when you read the pictures are in your head?
Yeah, right.
Yes, that's it.
What do you do when Baylor plays football away from home?
I'm going to take the test on that one, though.
That's all right. The second question, Danny.
Okay, I would say that when we had children at home, we did observe, and I encouraged our church to observe what we called a TV sabbatical from Mother's Day to Father's Day. And if the dads could get through the first 2 weeks, they really were grateful for it. I don't know, because of how countercultural it is, whether we can get our church people to actually kill their TV or not.
Right.
But I do have siblings who have done that. My second question is, what is the sociological and philosophical framework for a church or a pastor to speak to secularization and bring about a biblical moral philosophy and biblical view of the family that doesn't just wait for secularization to run its course, but to actually take it on in our culture? I hear you saying that secularization will finally end by attrition, pretty much. But what's the framework that we can use from the pulpit and in a church setting to help confront that rather than just wait for it to die?
Okay, who's the courageous
Well,
one?
quickly, that's a wonderful question, and I love the spirit of that question, because I think of it this way. That is a question about how do we play offense and not defense, right? Because all we're doing is playing defense, or so it feels a lot of the time. And so when I think about this, how do we get onto offense? I think about things like the imaginary initiative that I mentioned, Mothers Against Pornography. You know, I think about how do we find ways of doing end runs around some of this stuff so that we're not just stuck in the middle of the field with, you know, everybody pushing back against us. One thing I think about is how do we make inroads to places where we don't usually think of going. In my own work, an example would be, I'm so struck by the passion with which people approach animal welfare. And I think a lot of that is good. I think those are people we can have a conversation with, which isn't to say people have to go vegan or vegetarian, but think about the moral energy that goes into worrying about baby seals being clubbed to death, you know? Those people aren't all kooks. I think we could make common cause, and I also think we could enlarge the understanding of the sanctity of human life if we could work with some of the animal people a little. Okay, so that's not a moral have-to, but it's an example of the kind of proactive thinking that I think we need to do, you know, building new alliances, looking for opportunities where we can find them. Thank you for that question.
David, go ahead.
Yeah, that really is the big question, and I have virtually nothing useful to say to it, except it's clear that the framework has to be communal. When we got rid of our TV, when our kids were very young, and I thought we're going to raise kids TV-free, we couldn't get a babysitter because it was okay. The kids were okay. I even survived it, but no, none of the teenagers in the neighborhood would come to our house to babysit. So we had to bring the TV back. So now, part of the point there is we can only have these frameworks in communities. And when I was talking before about these wonderful young couples who were hanging around the Notre Dame campus and having 9 kids, I wasn't suggesting that you needed to start over again, that everybody needed to be one of these families. I mean, after all, monastic life, when it entered Western culture in the 4th and 5th centuries, transformed everything. That wasn't because everybody became a monk, and nobody ever thought everybody should become a monk, but we had a model of a certain kind of life. And we clearly, when we talk about frameworks, and this is where churches, especially smaller churches can handle problems of scale, can be so important. We need lots of people working together to share books, to share chores, to share babysitters, so you can have babysitters come to your house who come from homes where there isn't a TV already. And that's where churches can do so much to build new communities. I find that I've been involved in some of the parish nurse programs where you can build communities, medical communities around parishes, and you have at the back of the Catholic church every Sunday morning a nurse sitting back there who will kind of help out. We can have consultants about families, so we can build communities where people use literature, they see the right kinds of movies. In the end, though, we need to have ideas that can be deployed in church settings that take seriously in an adult way the kind of problems that young people and families confront today. I mean, this is a problem that requires intellectual resources and social resources, but mainly communities and structures. And we don't know yet what they're going to be. The book that guides me through all this stuff is my mentor, Alistair McIntyre's Great Book After Virtue, and he ends it with this sort of poignant line about what we're waiting for now is another, as he says, doubtless quite different Saint Benedict. Now, he didn't mean everybody should, again, become a monk, but what Saint Benedict was bringing a new way of living together. It's not just a framework, it's a way of living together, growing out of churches that allows families to sustain themselves and fight off the perils of television, MTV. I mean, all these things are part of that. I think one can't say anymore, one can't complain about rock music without becoming, but rock music did enormously bad things to people, and I still don't know how to deal with that. The impact it had on my own children, in fact, impact it had on me. But we, as communities, we can face these problems better.
Let me just add 1 minute to that. The book that Mary referred to, How Religion Unites and Divides Us by Putnam, he's a completely secular social scientist, first rate, and in this book, he acknowledges the power of congregations. He won't go so far as to say it's the power of prayer to change things, but what he does say is it's the power of these incredible, vibrant networks within congregations where people support each other that can change things. And so, you know, to echo what Mary said and what David was just saying, I think that the answer lies within all these congregations, over 300,000 of them in America. And it doesn't just fall on pastors who, you know, we're so happy to have pastors here today, but lay-led movements within these congregations, I think, can be really vital to pushing back.
Last question, or last comment.
Good morning. I'm Dick Conwisher. I wanted to thank the panel for their insights and perspectives that they've so lucidly shared with us. My question is in regard to a game plan or playing offense. What is the role of the church in Christian education from a full-time private Christian schooling standpoint, beginning from preschool on up through high school, to play offense against the secular schools that are hamstrung by political correctness and textbooks that we don't approve of?
Got it?
I didn't
Well,
get the question.
The question is, what is the role of the church in supporting private schools, perhaps connected to the church? Right. Good thing or bad thing?
How could that be a bad thing?
Yeah, thought I'd make the question obvious.
How could it be a bad thing? The vibrancy of those schools is one of the grounds for optimism, it seems to me. So is the extraordinary growth of the homeschooling movement. I don't know how many students are homeschooled now, but I was on the campus of Ave Maria University recently, and they told me that half their student body is homeschooled. Half the student body, and it's not because so many Catholics are out there homeschooling, it's because the homeschooled kids tend to learn so much that they are disproportionately represented in universities and colleges. So both, you know, the private school, the homeschool, you know, anything that counters the toxic public education system, or the often morally toxic public education system, is all to the good, I would say.
You know, one of the most, I mean, my experience has been so much in the Catholic world, I keep going back to this, but the creation of Catholic schools in the 19th century and what they did for immigrants and preserving a kind of culture is just extraordinary. And I think, and we all know what's happened to public schools, and yeah, I think this it's absolutely crucial. And here there are experiments. You talked about the experiments with single-parent living, and we worry about. Here, I think experimentation is going to be great for us. We've learned a lot about home schooling, and we've learned a lot about these sort of pop-up schools that set through some real disasters, and there's reason for optimism.
Okay, Drew, you get the last word.
I do? Oh, boy. Well, my kids go to public school and have been very happy and successful there. There are things you can get from a public school, right, especially in terms of fine arts, which is very important to me and my spiritual development, that is much harder to get. I think, once again, it's important not to be isolationist and to say, well, you know, we're going to form these little islands of home schools or classical schools or private schools. I think it's very important to recognize that you know, there are many different vocations, there are many different modes of education, and that the Holy Spirit is present in all of them, and that there are. Yeah, that there are as many, well, there are really as many roads into Jerusalem as there are people, and it's a question of finding them.
Let's thank our panelists.